Pacific Western Law School or Tulane Law School, is a representative of the tradition of American jurisprudence or common law jurisprudence to the same extent that a professor at UCLA is. Well, there might, in my cases, some cases, it might be, an exceptional professor who, for some reason, ended up teaching in that small, marginal law school. But in most cases, they belong to that tradition, but they don't represent that tradition. They're not the moving power within that tradition. If that tradition was, if this tradition became entrusted to them, it would collapse, because they have not the training and not the intellectual faculties and not the abilities to and this is why I one of the most controversial things, and especially when I go back home and I confront sheikhs and I lead my battles with Azharite sheikhs and so on. Interestingly, for all the battles with other sheikhs, till now, Azhar sends me the students who have scholarships from Azhar to do their doctorates under my supervision, because they ultimately have to acknowledge that the training that these students get from me is not available, at least not available out in public and in a legitimate context and in a safe atmosphere back home. Back home, those who still have this critical, analytical approach are constantly hiding and very quiet, and it's very secretive, and as I said, it's all a strictly, so people go to Azhar and they study from Malaysia, and when I visited, I meet all these kids that said, yeah, we studied Azhar for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and they talk about how older sheikhs emphasize rote memorization, and then they would talk about how they would hear about a sheikh that is ostracized by within Azhar, that he's not popular with the administration, he's not popular with the government, that offers classes either in a mosque close to his home or at his home, or sheikh owns, and like one of the sheikhs I studied was a bookshop, that he held his halaqas in the bookshop. And then if they're fortunate, they would try to get somehow in to have the privilege of sitting in one of these halaqas. Point is that a lot of the point of clash is that I believe today that to call yourself a faqih, remember faqih means knowledge, right? You have to look at what constitutes epistemology today. You can't simply pretend like the epistemology of today is epistemology of centuries ago. And the training of a jurist, it's in the Islamic intellectual tradition, but within the modern epistemic systems. And so my idea of a jurist that's authentic to the Islamic tradition, and the same that a jurist authentic to the Islamic tradition would, whether they would do it to refute it or do it to support it, they would have to study the Greek tradition, and like Ibn Taymiyyah's famous refutation of Greek logicians. I mean, if you ever get a chance to check out that book from the library, and try to make it as an experiment, try to go through it, you will find it so dense, so philosophically subtle, that you simply have to ask yourself, where did Ibn Taymiyyah get the training in Greek logic to this level? that he engages in this. I mean, I had to read this book 3 times, and I still need to read it more because the philosophical subtleties are so nuanced that if you have a moment of lack of clarity in your thinking, boom, you've missed it. You know, and so the idea of you know this insulated sheikh who's just memorizing traditions, or even you know in the extreme form burying manuscripts in the desert just to preserve them, and you know taking them out to look at them every once in a while, or perhaps have a session where he gets the elders and they all sit and reread one book and then close it and put it back again. That is not the tradition we're talking about. And today's jurist, today's faqih, not only epistemology, but must like the fuqaha of the past, they must study jurisprudence, the human's contributions to the science of jurisprudence, whether to engage it, whether they agree with it or not, that's not the point. But this various schools of thoughts of the jurisprudence, in the same way that within the medieval context, any respectable name within the juristic tradition was keenly aware of the various theories of law and order that have been proposed around them in the world, and contextually so. So when you look at Fatawa al-Hindiyya, for instance, you find that the jurists of al-Fatawa al-Hindiyya had a particular facility with Hindu paradigms of law. While if you look at Al-Wansharisi, it's clear that Al-Wansharisi recorded jurists who had particular facilities with Latin arguments about law and royal power and sovereignty and so on and so forth. And they are, you can place them fully within their time. Now, if you have that type of outlook, you have that type of standard, then the modern shuyukh, the modern fuqaha, look very different than our inherited image of the local preacher in the mosque who leads prayer and so on. I mean, I have to use my ijazah. I don't consider that preacher a faqih. To me, they are an imam. But they're not a faqih. And I might be an imam, I might not, depending on whether I have a congregation, but I am a faqih. And again, the lapsing of the two in the Muslim mind has wreaked havoc. Not every imam is a faqih, and not every faqih is an imam. One is anchored in social dynamics, the other is anchored in epistemic dynamics.
What is it? The one from how to differentiate it?
Social.
Social.
Yeah, because the imam performs a social dynamic. He services a community like a reverend. He goes to bake sales. I mean, of course, in the Western, he goes to bake sale. Yeah, the equivalent to a bake sale. He goes to the births of children. He goes to marriages. But his job is not to study the ins and outs of jurisprudential theory or knowledge or philosophy and so on. And a faqih could never could be completely isolated in a library, as many of them were. They never lead prayer, they never do marriages, they never conduct burials, they never attend birth celebrations, and that doesn't. But in the same, I'll tell you another thing that, like in the Islamic tradition, there used to be a very strong distinction between the Qussas and the Muhaddithin. The Muhaddithin were transmitters of tradition. They were scholarly trained to narrate traditions and look into chains of transmission and so on and so forth. The Fuqaha had a very famous statement that هم الصيادلة ونحن الأطباء. They are like the Muhaddithin, they are like pharmacists. Okay, they preserve the different chemicals, but fuqaha are like doctors. They're the ones who have to make the diagnosis and do the analytical process and say, okay, this medicine. So now, how about the Qussas? They would say, the Qussas are not muhaddithin because they do not know the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil, of inspecting chains of narration and assessing authenticity and so on. And they are not atibba, definitely. They are a pietistic performance. فهم من أهل الدين, or فهم دعاة الدين, as they would call it in that. They say moral stories to increase the piety of people without regard to the scholastic position of these stories. And that's why for centuries these stories were just oral narratives memorized from one generation to another. And part of the collapse that happens is when the Qussas and the Muhaddithin category starts blurring, and they start sort of but even worse, and this is now a disaster, it's not just a problem, is when the boundaries between the Qussas, Muhaddithin and Fuqaha has become all blurred. So most of us who have gone through a madrasa tradition, at least all the way in the, until you reach what the equivalent of undergraduate studies, the people you interact with are imams, they're not fuqaha. The people you interact with are more like Qussas. They memorize the Quran, maybe traditions, but they don't authenticate traditions. They don't have any idea how to authenticate traditions. And their mind is full of mythology. So, they'll tell you stories about, what happens to you in the grave. I mean, an example, one guy, it's a group in Saudi Arabia that became so fascinated by the stories about what happens in the grave and azab al-qabr, the punishment in the grave and so on. They asked the Sheikh Uthaymeen if they can install a camera after they bury a person, so they can observe azab al-qabr. And they were so far, and he said no, because this is it's all going on.
But in the internet, it's recently around such kind of film made by, I don't know, but it's reported that they install camera in the grave, and they show indicator that what we call resurrection in the graves happening, and
it's around. But these are Muslims that did this.
It's probably yeah, Muslims, I think.
I mean,
In
like,
Siberia
Resurrection
or
hasn't
something.
happened. Has anybody seen it? I'm not seeing
Yeah.
it. So why are
when,
people resurrecting
when
it?
no, I mean, it's not on the final judgment day when I used the term resurrection, but
Oh.
because according to the tradition that people will be asked some question in the grave, and those who cannot answer will be punished, and they show it's kind of
Looks like
sound.
the person is upset.
Yeah, sound.
Okay. Looks like the person is maybe undergoing
Yeah, I mean,
interrogation from the
it's-
angels.
The point is that although, I mean, this is in the metaphysical world. It is possible to transcend the physical to the metaphysical, but you do it through not your normally sensory perceptions. So, when people come and say, I felt an evil presence, I believe them. There could have been an evil presence. But if they sense that not with their eyes or ears or so on, I mean, and then we could get into whether is it possible for something so evil that it violates the laws of God by breaking these are other things. But the point is the impact of the qasas. Like a lot of the traditions about azab al-qabr, many of them are quite of problematic authenticity, and there are so many of these narrations that are truly emerged within the tradition of the qasas, and they're repeated, and there is, it's like it's like when we say what is the ijtihad of the Wahhabis, some of the Wahhabis supposedly went and they didn't like any of the bid'ah or the superstition, and they wanted to bring Muslims back to Sirat al-Mustaqim and so on. But increasingly their tradition, because as I noted, that human beings would be forced to practice their activity somewhere. The primary Wahhabi influence, for instance, today in a lot of parts of the Arab world, I don't know outside the Arab world, but I suspect it's probably the same, is an obsession with jinn and demonic possession and exorcisms, and when I was growing up in Egypt, it was part of the juristic training that I'll be honest with you, I read texts on the rites of exorcism. And I was taught that there are rare situations where it does happen, and it's always because the person has invited it, has consented to it, and has brought in that evil, etc., etc. And that you may engage that in a battle of will and to do. But you were also thoroughly instructed that you do not talk about it, you do not discuss it. If you do it, you don't have observers or spectators. You don't write accounts about it. You only tell other specialists for the purpose of training. Because the idea is it very easily could become mass hallucinations and hysteria and so on. And so and then even then, like Muhammad al-Ghazali disagreed. He was upset when he learned that I was reading the text with the sheikh on the rites of exorcism, because for him it's like, this is but this type of qasas atmosphere, when every Joe Mo sits on TV and and they show you on TV, oh here, look, I'm doing an exorcism, and some really bizarre things, like I know a so-called exorcist in Egypt. Of course, as always, some people who are pretty much failures in life. They haven't achieved anything. They're not very intelligent. They're not very ambitious. They're not accomplished. They're not educated. So what he decides to do is that he opened up an office to practice exorcism. He's got the Quran memorized, and so. And very strange things. He goes and says, I talked to this woman and she was yawning, and constant yawning is clear evidence of possession. I don't know. Tell me, is this rooted in the Islamic tradition? I tell you, you'll find some origins for it in the mythologies of the Qusas, but the remarkable thing is that finding creative space. I mean, human beings will find creative space, but it's either they will find it in healthy ways, they will increase their spirituality and improve the well-being of human beings and increase human serve human well-being and happiness and increase the conditions conducive to understanding and reflecting upon God's beauty, or they will exercise their creativity in constantly unproductive or sometimes counterproductive fashions that becomes very much like the mad delusions of crowds. There's a book in English, I think it was a British author wrote it. It's called the mad delusions of crowds, and it's actually a really interesting book because this British author tells you about, or maybe he was American, I don't remember. But the book is really fun to read because this guy documents how easy it is for someone touting all types of mythology can make people act in completely insane, mad ways, and the whole suspicion of the juristic elite towards the laity is consistently, is because of their tendency to jump on emotions and act on emotions and jump to conclusions, and they don't have the restraint to hold back judgment and so on. And so often it was drilled in me. My advanced teachers is that the difference between a jurist and actually it's probably you've heard all of these traditions as well. Difference between a jurist and a real jurist and a non-jurist is a real jurist feels that the certainty rarely. A real jurist, you most of the time you ask them, they say, I don't know. And even when they answer, their answer says, well, what I think is this, and God knows best, but and their real jurist is not catering to the crowds. The real jurist is reserved and self-effacing, and humility is not an act. Humility is an inner trait. We sometimes, like in being a law professor, although I, top of my class in law school, but these traits that were instilled in me as a jurist, I want to tell you, they gave me a lot of problems in an atmosphere where people are promoting themselves, an atmosphere of remarkable egoism and self-promotion. So I was trained that because if you have real knowledge, you'd sit, you're quiet, you don't interrupt people, you don't lose your temper, you're never rude with your professor, but you ask questions and you ask them in the hypothetical and in a way that respects it. So and that was taken for timidity and dullness of intellect. My first semester in law school until the grades came out. I was. Everyone in the class just thought that I'm probably going to end up being at the end of my class, it was the worst grades because I wouldn't yell at people. No, you're wrong, and how can you say that? My style is I was trained with oh well, that's a very good opinion, but have you thought of perhaps they did and so when the grades came out and people discovered that, oh my God, where is this coming from? And they tell you that in the legal academia in the U.S. that if you want to be a successful professor, you have to always act as if you're throwing pearls to swine. Like when you talk, you always have to, speak as if you're just I'll honor you by giving you something of my brilliance, and you're told that if you don't do that, then people don't respect you and so on. Actually, I just here is where I find. Here's where I come down on my values of classical Islamic tradition. But it's not just Islam, because I've met scholars from Korea or Japan who are very much the same demeanor. One of my most brilliant students is a South Korean student, and the thing I love about her is, she starts, before saying anything, she always starts with, "Excuse me, but Sarah, I think such and such." I think that's beautiful, because what she ends up saying is very brilliant. But she's always like, "Excuse me," she's always as if saying, "Okay, but I want to make a contribution, but I don't want to take away from yours." That's very beautiful, and it's something that. So this is a really an important thing, because it's really, we have to rethink. I am all for the reinventing of the role of the faqih, but what is a faqih must be reinvestigated. A lot of times I find students who are Islamically committed but have the analytical tools of modern knowledge closer to the faqih paradigm than the imams of a lot of mosques. And so I used to joke with George Maqdisi, who's not Muslim. And told him, you have no idea to what extent you remind me of the best of my teachers. You must be a closet faqih, and because he was that. He lived among books, and his whole life was in inquiry into it, and he knew about Islamic intellectual tradition far more than 99% of the imams of the Muslim world. Muslim students would come who studied in Azhar and other traditional institutions, so on, they would be blown over by how much he knows of their tradition now. Is that doesn't give you an example of what is, the only thing is that he was not Muslim. He was sort of not Muslim or not Christian either, but
It sounds like he's like a Lebanese Christian background or something like that with that name.
Yeah, he's a Lebanese Christian background. I mean, he would. I don't know what his, but it was irrelevant what his religion was. Yeah, the whole issue of him. I mean, he was among those that actually spoke about this quite openly. He said, what gave him a lot of people, he was what gave him the courage to write a lot of texts is that people expected that as a Lebanese Christian that he would say a certain, present a certain narrative, and then it would be a completely different narrative, and you couldn't accuse him of being, but it was